It would be interesting to know that in this group, the number of people who have said, I can't believe it's December already. I know of two, because I'm one of them, and Greg Chandler made the announcement this morning and stated that. But I imagine that if you are of any age, you probably said that. And if you're getting older, I'm almost positive you said it. Because it just seems like the year rolls by quickly anymore. And when we get to December, for whatever reason, there's a time typically of reflection. That we begin to think back over the year, to look at our accomplishments or perhaps even our failures, to look at what we were planning at the beginning of the year, where we are now. And that's a good thing to do. A lot of businesses do that, schools do that. But I think it's extremely important for the people of God to do that, both individually, each of us evaluating ourselves, but also each of us evaluating our church, the group with which we're working. And so this evening, for a few minutes, I want us to think about that idea. And as Joe mentioned, we're going to take this from the introductory part of the book of Revelation, which I agree fully. That first chapter is an amazing chapter, which certainly gives the glory of Jesus. But one thing in particular that we want to look at this evening is what he says in verse 20 of chapter 1, where he says, "As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." So we've got heaven and earth under consideration here, kind of an indication that the Lord has something to say whichever realm you're in. But specifically, he's going to talk here about those 7 churches, and he says they are 7 lampstands. Now, another place where Jesus is going to talk about light, in a sense, and we'll look at that here in just a minute, but that section is going to help us with this part of Revelation. Because as we look in Matthew chapter 5, in verse 15, Jesus says, "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And it gives light to all the house." So what we have pictured here is a platform of some kind on which you would put your light. And we'll see here in just a minute where he compares us to that light. But in the book of Revelation, he's comparing the churches to the lampstand. So the idea is that these churches are elevating him within their part of the world, where they're working, where they're serving to influence. And so because of that, Jesus gives a very stern warning to the first church, and by implication, all of those that follow, when he says in chapter 2, verse 5 of Revelation, to the church at Ephesus, "Remember therefore from where you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent." So he's not necessarily saying the light's going to go out of the community, but their place in spreading that light. That he's going to remove that association with them. And that's such a powerful thought to consider, that we can think we are a church that belongs to Christ. We can say that we're a church that belongs to Christ, but it's Christ who says whether or not we're a church that belongs to Him. And so like these 7 churches, it behooves any group of God's people, any church, to pause and to think about their relationship to Him and to consider what it means to be in that association. So as we consider that this evening, we need to begin first of all by self-evaluation. Before we can ever talk about what a church needs to do, we must begin with ourselves, and that takes us then to this other illustration that we referenced earlier. As Jesus was preaching, He said, "I'm the light of the world." John chapter 8 quotes that, where Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." What's really interesting about this is that He says the same thing to His followers. Back in the book of Matthew chapter 5, just prior to the verse that we read earlier, He says, "You are the light of the world." And so the thing that Jesus says about Himself, He says about His followers also, that you're this city that's sitting up on a hill and you can't be hidden. And so the Lord is saying to us, one of our responsibilities in this life is to let others see Him living in us, that's how we spread our light. Thus, when we think about a church, what we understand is that church is only as strong as its individual members. That church is only accomplishing good things if its members are allowing their lights to shine. And for sure, we see that here in these 7 churches in Asia. Now, we don't have time this evening to go through and look at all of those, but let me just give you a quick little glance at what's said here. I just tried to pull out the main thing. Several of these churches, there's 2 or 3 things said about them. But the church at Ephesus, it appears the main point that the Lord's getting across to them is you've lost your first love. You say you follow me, but it's not like it was at the beginning. And to the church at Pergamum, you're allowing people and ideas that are opposed to me to have a place in your fellowship. And at Thyatira, you're tolerating evil. You're letting people be in your midst who are corrupting you. And just straight out to the church at Ephesus, he says you've got a name that you're alive but dead. And to the church at Laodicea, he says you're apathetic. You're going through the motions, but I'm not there with you. I'm standing outside. 2 churches. All he does is compliment them. To the church at Smyrna, he says you withstood during the time of persecution. And to the church at Philadelphia, he says you endure even during the hard times. Now, we look at all of these, but the point that I want us to see is this. Those congregational attitudes grew out of individual attitudes. There were people who were influencers in those churches. There were people who were either leading in the wrong direction or leading in the right direction, and there were individual decisions being made. Yet, when this group comes together, the Lord is passing judgment on them collectively. He's saying, all of you are responsible for this, and you either need to change, or as in the case of the latter 2, you need to continue on. So anytime we evaluate ourselves, we realize it's got to begin with a self-evaluation. We got to look at our lives and we've got to see where we belong and to ask ourselves the question, have I allowed the light of Jesus to live in me? Now, once we do that, we can then turn our attention to community faithfulness. As we said, there are times when God judges a church collectively. Now, He's looking at individuals within it, but He's saying, when you come together, you're to accomplish a purpose. You're to elevate me. You're to allow others to see me. As we consider this idea, there are a number of different things we can talk about. Let me just kind of narrow it down this evening and talk about a few different attitudes that we're going to look at, but all of them beginning with this revelation question. That when we look at the Gooch Lane Church, when we evaluate ourselves, what do we come up with? Now, it's helpful that our elders do this each year and then give us their take on how things are going. I've always enjoyed that and seeing it. But yet it's a work for every one of us to do. That we ask ourselves, when I look at myself first, and then when I look at my association with this church and viewing us collectively, are we elevating? Are we the lampstand that Jesus wants us to be? So how do we know the answer to that? Well, let's examine some of these attitudes. It all begins and ends with our attitude about God. Churches can sometimes go through the motions. Churches sometimes can get way off track and become much more intrigued by the church rather than the God that they're purportedly serving. And I think one of the ways that churches can see that pretty clearly, amongst a number of different ways, is in the attitude toward worship. How does a church recognize the importance of God? Well, one of the ways that that's going to be shown is the collective worship that's being offered. It's no accident that God is saying you need to come together and you need to spend time in community pouring out your praise to me. So as we look at that, we think about passages like Hebrews chapter 12 that tell us something about worship. Verses 8 and 9, he says, "Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship. Well, what is acceptable worship? It's worship that's accompanied with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. So any church that's evaluating its service to God, any church that's viewing its attitude toward God, has got to ask the question, when we come together and we worship, is our worship reflecting reverence? When God hears our praises, are they offered reverently to Him? Is it dignified worship that's befitting a king? And is it respectful worship? We can say some of that responsibility falls to those who direct us. It's a significant task. When you are a song leader and you are choosing the songs that a group is going to join together in singing, there's a lot going on in that. You got to make sure that it's, first of all, scriptural, that there's no ideas being presented in there that are in error. Is it something that's helpful? There are hymns that don't make the cut as the ages roll on because they never rose to prominence because the ideas weren't very good. Someone who's directing worship has got to decide that. Is it something that the congregation can join in? Everybody, wholeheartedly. You think about someone who does the Bible reading. This sometimes is a very underappreciated thing, I think. I don't want to embarrass him, but I was just so impressed with Nick's reading this morning. He made that passage in Hosea come alive to us. That showed me someone who had put thought in it. The prayers today, I don't know, maybe it's just me. The prayers seem particularly significant today. I appreciated Ben's this morning, where he prayed for those who may be struggling for any number of reasons during these months. Family, students facing finals, those of us who've been there realize that. Well, we know that people who are involved in this have a very major responsibility, but it's not their responsibility alone. Much more so. The answer to our attitude toward worship is going to be reflected in each member's participation in it. You can come up with a meaningful worship time. You can have the best songs, the best readings, the best prayers, but if a congregation does not love God, then the congregation is missing the entire point of that worship. And so I ask myself about me first, and then the church I'm a part of as a whole. Are we physically present for worship? That's kind of a strange one we've had to add in the last few years. But are we coming? Are we thinking along spiritual things? Now, I'm the only one who can answer that for me. But what I've got to realize is that if our worship is going to be pleasing to God, we're all concentrating on His greatness, His authority, His kingship, His love, all of these different things. And I'm also thinking about my fellow saints. Because while worship primarily is vertical, what we give to God, there's also that horizontal element where we're speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and we're praying for each other. And we're announcing our belief in the salvation of our Lord when we participate in the Lord's Supper together. Thus, if my attitude is where it needs to be, then I'm looking and I'm saying, okay, individually I'm doing this, but also I'm encouraging the rest of the congregation to do this also. We think also about our attitude toward increasing our knowledge of God's Word. This is something that this particular church has a strong reputation for doing. That there is a significant interest and a significant amount of attention placed on gaining that knowledge, and that is a very good thing that we do. And so there is a lot of work that goes into the preparation of Bible classes here. We have a Bible class, except for the very, very youngest, for any other age. And at times we may have as many as 4 adult classes going on simultaneously to try to help and provide for lots of different areas of learning. But once again, I have to evaluate my attitude toward that. Again, am I physically present for it? When I went back to school a few years ago and got my master's degree, I did it 100% online. It was a whole new experience. The quality of that education was far inferior to my undergraduate degree. I did all the work. I did all the reading, all the writing. But there's a give and take within a classroom setting that you can't accomplish through a screen. And while that's great for us if we're sick or if we're just to the point in life we can't get out, it is a fantastic tool to have. But what we must understand is it never replaces what goes on with Christians in the same physical location. As well, a Bible class is going to be much better if everyone's prepared for it. We all have lives, and I know there's times when we may not can get as much in as we want to, but yet to give something no thought beforehand really puts us at a disadvantage. That we're not in the mind frame to participate in that class, and for sure, a good Bible class is not going to be one person speaking. It's going to be a number of voices presenting ideas and things that have been thought of. Well, that means that the responsibility first falls to me. And then I consider how I can make that better for the congregation. Now, teachers bear a huge responsibility for this. An unprepared teacher is a teacher who is not going to be successful. We have to realize, though, one person doesn't make a class. If you've got just one person, that's only one idea that's coming across. Whereas if you've got a class where people are prepared and participating, you've got lots of ideas coming in. Now that somewhat differs from the other time of learning publicly that we have, and that's in sermons. This is not where you've got a number of voices, but one voice that's speaking the message of God's Word. And that person has a major responsibility. I can assure you I feel that pressure, especially with a group as biblically literate as this group. But what's got to be realized is that's not totally dependent on the one speaking. When we think about effective learning in a sermon, that means that we must be actively listening to what's being presented. I got very amused a few months ago. I was talking to a young man who's just kind of starting out preaching, and I heard one of his sermons. We were kind of talking about it, and I said, I noticed you kept getting a little louder right in the middle of it. He said, yeah, I looked out and people were going to sleep, so I decided I'd just talk louder. That is something that when you're young especially can kind of throw you. But active listening means there's an exchange going on. It's not going to be verbal, but it's nonverbal. It's nodding, paying attention. You know, I love to hear the pages rattling. I've said somebody needs to come up with an app that makes it sound like the pages are rattling if you're using an electronic Bible. Nonetheless, it's showing engagement. And that's what we've got to have. Thus, we think about, as a congregation, what are we doing? What are we offering? How are we participating in that offering? How are we responding to that offering? These things do no good if I'm not a part of it. And so as I consider the status of the candlestick or the lampstand, then I've got to realize that part of that, of lifting up Jesus, is going to be knowing more about Him, both individually and congregationally. So let's talk about just a couple of more. One that we've really focused on this year has been our associations with one another, with the concept of genuine love. And so while part of that has been more on a family level, much of it also has been on a congregational level. And the point that the elders have sought to engage us in is that, of course, loyalty to Jesus comes first, as we sung tonight. That to Him we are loyal and true. But there's also a loyalty to one another in that. Think about what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 12, when he said that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. That unity, that camaraderie is exactly what every church is needing. So when I make a decision to become a part of a church, what I'm saying to that church is, I'm committing to work with you. I'm committing to be a part of your number. It is not checking a box to say I'm going to come in, I'm going to fill a pew for an hour or two a week, and then I'm done. That is never found in the New Testament. It's always that working together as a unit for the glorification of Jesus. So as we examine our relationships with one another, it means they've got to be genuine. We focused a lot on that word this year. But it's an apt word for us to explain what it means to really love and to really care for someone else. And the genuineness of that relationship means that you're bound in the love of God. You may have nothing else in common with a fellow Christian other than that love for God, but that's enough. And that's what binds us together as a church. But I've got to be present for that to happen. I've got to be a part of the lives of those with whom I'm associated. I've got to be a part of what's going on with others that I'm working with. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but here are a couple of ideas we can consider. As a church, are we praying for each other? Are we praying for each other? We have lots of requests for that. But yet, we don't need to limit ourselves to that. If I realize there's someone who's having a terrible time, I'm praying for that person. Someone who's having a great experience in life, I'm praying for that person. I'm offering aid. I need not talk to this congregation about that because you get it right. I don't know of any need, physically speaking, that ever goes unmet. But yet, that's a way that we're committed to encouraging one another and showing hospitality to one another. I think as Americans, that's one that we struggle with a great deal, that just not a lot of people are hospitable. It's hard to get a real feel for that in any church without doing some formal survey. But the best I can tell in churches that I've worked with, it seems about 10% are actively involved in opening their homes to others. That needs to be much greater, because these are where the relationships are formed. This is where somebody gets to know the needs of someone else. And so, as I'm praying and giving my support and encouraging, I'm also opening my home, because being committed to one another is indicating in a very great deal my commitment to Jesus. And so as I think about my relationships with others, genuine love is always going to lift someone up. It is never to tear them down. Now, that doesn't mean that there will never be an occasion where we're not going to go and talk to somebody. We may need to do that. Maybe somebody who's struggling spiritually, maybe somebody who needs to be corrected. But it's always in love, never to tear that person down. Now, final attitude fits in very much with this one. And that's just simply our level of activity. Christians have never been called on to be spectators. We've never been called on to be people who just kind of sit back and watch everybody else do these things, whether it be for the Lord or for the church or whatever. There was a statement made many, many years ago that said it seems that in a lot of churches, 10% of the people are doing 90% of the work. I think that is true in some churches. I don't think that's true at this one. But what it means, regardless of the statistic of involvement, is that if I am a Christian, God is saying you need to have the same mentality as the Apostle Paul when he said, this is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. If we view ourselves as servants, it means we're going to be wearing ourselves out in this life for Jesus. And some of that work, a portion of it, is going to be in my association with the church. That a lot of what Jesus has told me to do is going to involve this group, this community of which I'm a part. And so I need to be prepared for that, and I need to be busy, and I need to be active in that. This church provides lots of opportunities. I started just to come up with a list and have it up here, but I was fearful I would leave something out. But let me just give you the top few. You ever thought about how many teachers it takes to keep our kids educated in biblical studies? You ever thought about how many women are dedicating themselves to these young minds, spending hours up here? You've got a number of men who are instrumental in teaching our junior high and high school classes. You've got men and women alike who are teaching adult classes. You've got organized activities for our young people to promote their spirituality. We could continue on. But what this is saying is, I don't have to look in the corner to find something to do. There is a ready, present opportunity just about any time I'm prepared to take it. So as I consider this church, I've got to ask myself, am I being a good part of that in keeping this church active? Am I being someone who's adding to the lampstand that's elevating Christ in what I do? For certain, all of us should be actively involved in evangelism. While there are many things that are going to support us as a congregation that are needed, such as been mentioned, there's also the need for everyone in this church to have an active interest in bringing the lost to Jesus. There's a lot of opportunities for that. More to come in 2024. Some very good ideas have been proposed that will be explained in just a few weeks. But what this means is that we as a group have got to look at our part of the world, and we've got to say, as the Gooch Lane Church, how much are we letting our light shine? How much are we doing, both individually and collectively, to allow the light of Jesus Christ to be spread in this community? But not only here, also with those with whom we partner in the preaching of the gospel. I feel quite confident that Larry can say that he appreciates the prayers of saints on his behalf. And I appreciate those too. Anyone who we're partnering with in spreading the gospel has a serious responsibility, but we also as a church have a serious responsibility that we're making sure that we're supporting those efforts, though we may not be there physically. And then for certain, one thing that all of us can do is to actively engage those who visit our assemblies. On any given Sunday morning, we may have as many as 30 people visiting our assembly. Now, some of those are family members, and we know them. You know, they may be parents coming with their adult children, or somebody's in town. But more and more, I'm seeing these are people who are coming in, moving to the area, looking for a church perhaps. Or they're here by someone's invitation. And they're kind of checking out the message. They're checking out what they find. As a congregation grows, there's an excuse that's sometimes given. And someone will say, well, I'm afraid to speak to a visitor because it might be a member here that I don't know. Okay, let's make a pact tonight, all right? None of us are going to get angry if a member introduces himself to us. Okay? It's going to be okay. And normally that's a good thing, because if you don't know the person, well, it's kind of time, right? It's time to know them. But let's not ever allow someone who has shown enough interest to walk into this building to see what's going on, to ever let them leave this building without being encouraged in what they've done, and a welcome and an opportunity to come back. That's what all of us need to be doing. So we take all these things and so many others we can talk about. We understand that whether we're talking about worship, or whether we're talking about our associations with each other, or our interest in learning the Bible, or the activities we're involved in, let's not give excuses as to why we can't. Let's not say all the reasons we can't do these things. Let's come up with what we can do. And while not everybody can do everything, all of us can do something. Let's make sure we are. So we take all this together and we realize that the only one who ultimately determines the status of our lampstand is Jesus Christ. But yet He's told us what He expects. He's told us what He desires, of what He wants with the church that's bearing His name. And so as I consider this individually, I give myself an evaluation. How did I do in 2023? Have I been more active? Have I been more involved with my fellow Christians? Have I been more involved in spreading the gospel? We evaluate ourselves, and if changes need to be made, we make them. We don't give ourselves some kind of way out and say, well, it never changes. No, we make the changes that we need. And then as we begin critiquing the congregation, critiquing the church of which we're a part of, we realize that it must always be for betterment. It's not simply a time to air our complaints. It's not simply a time to say, I don't like this or this or this or this. No. When I do an evaluation, it's to make an improvement in something. And so, if I make that critique, it's always accompanied with a solution. How can we as a group go about bettering this? How can we take something to the next level? And we always have a humble spirit when we do it. Anytime we are judging something, we do quite well to start from the attitude of humility. To realize, A, I may be wrong on this, so I need to talk it out and see, but if I found something that needs improvement, I'm going to be a source of helping for that improvement, being a source of helping for that change. And when we can employ these kinds of attitudes, we'll not have a perfect church because a perfect church does not exist. But we will have a church that's working together as a lampstand to elevate the light of Jesus Christ so that it can be seen within this building, it can be seen within this community, and through our partnerships with those preaching throughout the world, it can be seen in many other places. And I hope we're ready to do that. Appreciate your good attention this evening. Let me just conclude by going to the other use of light. And that's where Jesus says, you let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. That's where it begins. And as we discussed this morning, it begins by realizing I'm lost in sin. And were it not for the love of God, I would be forever there. But God has shown His love for me. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. And so this evening, if you're ready to start letting your light shine for Jesus Christ, it begins by becoming His follower, a part of His body. And that happens in the waters of baptism. And so I encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. But for all of us, to consider how brightly our light is shining and to consider how we're working together to promote Jesus Christ. You need to respond to His invitation. You can come while we stand and sing together.